Armenia Titizian.
And I'm Rubina Margosian, and this is the Week in Review.
Every week we bring you the stories shaping Armenia and the region.
From politics and policy to social issues and conflict, we break down the news and what it means for you.
This week in the news: new parliament, familiar faces with familiar political theatrics. 1 year after the Washington summit, progress on peace, but key issues remain. Moscow pressures Yerevan over EU membership and imposes new trade restrictions. And civil contract confirms Armenia's new constitution will omit the Declaration of Independence. These stories and more in our weekly roundup of the news.
Well, after taking a short break during the first week of August, we're back and quite a bit has happened while we were away, but we'll begin with the first session of Armenia's newly elected National Assembly. This podcast, the Parliament has held its first session on August 2. Ruben Rubinian, who previously served as Deputy Speaker, replaced Alen Simonian. Haik Gonjorian and Vahagan Alexanian were elected Deputy Speakers, while Strong Armenia Opposition MP Aram Vartevanian was elected as the third Deputy Speaker, as required by law. Parliament also finalized the distribution of leadership positions across its 12 standing committees. Civil Contract will chair 8 committees, Strong Armenia 3, and the Armenia Faction 1. The opposition will also hold 4 of the 12 deputy chair positions. Among the more notable appointments, the pro-Russia Strong Armenia Faction will head the European Integration Committee, while the Armenia Faction, led by former President Robert Kocharian, who did not take his mandate, by the way, will chair the Human Rights Committee, despite Kocharian's presidency being marked by serious human rights concerns, including the deadly crackdown on protesters following the 2008 presidential election.
It's kind of ironic, right, Rubina, that a pro-Russian, or what's known as a pro-Russian party, takes up EU integration. And they chose that. I mean,
yes.
they had the option.
We were looking into how the process was distributed. So there's several rounds, and each party gets to choose several times. So that's how the distribution had happened.
Right.
And Strong Armenia chose EU integration and, Armenia Alliance human rights. Anyway, back to the parliament. The ruling party will retain control over key committees, including defense and security, foreign relations, and state and legal affairs. The National Assembly has also approved the creation of an ad hoc committee on parliamentary ethics proposed by Civil Contract. The factions are expected to nominate members for the committee in the coming days, and Maria, it's been exactly how we expected.
Yeah, more of the same. Theatrics, and I think you're enjoying it a little bit too much.
I wish I had time to follow every single session more in detail. Yeah. If that was my main job, I would have done it. I think there would have been a lot of commentary, but it's very concerning because we secretly hoped that maybe this parliament would function a little differently.
More like a parliament.
More like a parliament, however, no.
Yeah. I mean, for those who don't know, what's happened now is that there's familiar faces on both sides of the floor, and they're just like poking at each other. And, I think it was the beginning session, one of the opposition MPs had turned his back to the podium. And then they're like banging on
every time that the Civil Contract doesn't say the Catholicos and calls his civilian name, the opposition is banging on the tables while the ruling party is clapping, and the vice versa. Every time the opposition says something that's a little upsetting for the ruling party,
they start banging
on the tables. So it's a circus.
I hope they mature a little bit in the coming weeks and months. We'll see. Moving on, 9 of Armenia's 10 regional governors have been reappointed. The one Godaik governor Aharon Sahagyan, who was on the civil contract ballot, has taken up his parliamentary mandate, so they have to find a replacement for him. The cabinet has also remained largely intact. The only change is that the Ministry of High-Tech Industry, where David Tadevosyan has replaced Mkhitar Hayrabedian. The reason for Hayrabedian's resignation has not been made public. There's a lot of, speculation there, but we don't know what the real reason for that is. The government is also appointing new deputy ministers, including individuals with degrees from some of the world's top universities, because back in June, Prime Minister Pashinyan called on Armenian experts who had graduated from the world's top 100 universities to join the government, offering competitive salaries and, according according to the Prime Minister, just over 1,100 people applied within 2 months of that call. Around 459 candidates have been shortlisted, and several have already been appointed.
As we knew, as Pashinyan had said previously, there wouldn't be a lot of changes in the government, and there haven't been,
Right.
save one or two. But one appointment, one change has become topic of a lot of discussion. This is former Parliament Speaker Alen Simonian being appointed as Secretary of Armenia's Security Council, replacing Armen Grigoryan. Well, following the election and Seoul Contract's decision to elect Ruben Rubinian as Parliament Speaker, Simonian, a key member of Pashinyan's, inner circle, announced that he would not take up his parliamentary mandate. Until the recent announcement, it was unclear whether he would be given a position in the government or not. At some point, even rumors that he was going to be appointed president. Armen Grigoryan, on the other hand, had served as Secretary of the Security Council since 2018, becoming one of the most visible advocates of Armenia's post-2020 security and foreign policy shifts, playing an important role in negotiations with Western partners. His departure marks one of the most significant personnel changes, as we said, in Pashinyan's new government. And it's unclear whether or not he will stay in the government or not. Pashinyan has personally said that he has offered positions in the government, which he has, according to Pashinyan, declined.
Armenia's ruling Civil Contract Party has, for the first time, officially confirmed that the draft of the country's new constitution will not include a reference to the Declaration of Independence. This position had previously been articulated by Nikol Pashinyan, but this marks its first formal confirmation by the ruling party in parliament. The announcement was made by Arusyak Chulhakian, Civil Contracts nominee to chair the National Assembly's Standing Committee on State and Legal Affairs, and she's also a member of the Constitutional Reforms Council. The issue has become particularly contentious as Azerbaijan continues to demand constitutional amendments to remove what it describes as territorial claims against Azerbaijan, linking the issue to the finalization of a peace agreement with Armenia. Pashinyan has argued that Armenia's current constitution no longer reflects present-day realities and needs to be amended to safeguard the country's interests. Before the June parliamentary elections, Pashinyan said a civil contract victory would be followed by a constitutional referendum. The party won a parliamentary majority but fell short of the two-thirds majority it needs to pass constitutional amendments on its own, meaning it will need opposition support. Chulhakian said the draft of the new constitution will be published by the end of the year, followed by broad public discussions. But, they keep talking about releasing the draft, for now?
Which we've been expecting, yes, for a while now. Well, Chulhakian did said that they're basically drafting a whole new constitution. It's not amendments to the existing one. So
I guess we'll find out.
We'll find out by the end of the year if
it happens.
It happens. Well, in other news, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the United States issued a joint statement marking the first anniversary of the August 8 Washington summit. They said engineering surveys for the trip route are underway in Armenia, while Azerbaijan has nearly completed highway and railway works connecting to the route. In a separate statement, Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan said the peace process agreed in Washington was now visible and tangible to everyone. He argued that Armenia's June parliamentary elections showed voters had not only endorsed the process, but taken ownership of it. At the same time, he acknowledged that major issues remain unresolved, including the demarcation of the Armenia-Azerbaijan border and the continued imprisonment of Armenians in Azerbaijan. Pashinyan also said that both sides should move away from competing return narratives, referring to calls for the return of Armenians to Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan's claims regarding the return of Azerbaijanis to what it calls Western Azerbaijan, arguing that this is necessary to make peace irreversible.
Well, on that note, he also spoke with Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev that same day. According to readouts from both governments, they discussed the progress made over the past year, including Azerbaijani oil product exports to Armenia and transit shipments through Azerbaijan. They also discussed the implementation of TRIP. Pashinyan also spoke with U.S. President Donald Trump, thanking him for hosting the summit last year and witnessing the joint declaration. According to the Armenian readout, the two leaders reaffirmed their intention to begin construction of the TRIP route in the near future. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio separately announced that the Trans-Caspian Enterprise Fund, formerly known as TRIP Plus, is now operational. So basically, they've changed the name to the Trans-Caspian Enterprise Fund. He said the fund has been capitalized with $201 million in U.S. funding and has a newly elected board. At the same time, France, Germany, and the UK also issued statements marking the anniversary of the Washington Accord. efforts.
Days before the first anniversary of the Washington summit, Armenian officials held meetings in Yerevan with U.S. officials and representatives of the Trans-Caspian Enterprise Fund. Pashinyan and Foreign Minister Mirzoyan met with Arya Lightstone, a senior advisor to U.S. Special Envoy for Peace Mission Steve Witkoff, and Konstantin Sokolov, chair of the Trans-Caspian Enterprise Fund. According to Armenia's foreign ministry, they reviewed progress since the summit and discussed further steps on peace, regional connectivity, and Armenia's integration into international transport infrastructure. Meanwhile, in Washington, the deputy foreign ministers of Armenia and Azerbaijan, Vahan Kostanyan and Elnur Mamedov, also met with U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Alison Hooker. The three discussed progress over the past year, regional infrastructure projects, confidence-building measures, and what they described as the need to address existing humanitarian issues. Kostanyan also met with a senior vice president at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They discussed expanding economic ties between Armenia and the United States, including cooperation in agriculture, energy, and information technology.
In the meantime, Aliyev said that Azerbaijan's railway will reach the Armenian border next year and insisted that construction of Armenia's 42-kilometer section of the route must begin this year. Aliyev also said Azerbaijani specialists had already carried out work on Armenian territory to plan a power line to Nakhichevan. I think it's important that we stress that this is a multimodal road, so a rail that will potentially also have fiber optic cables, electricity cables running alongside it. He suggested that Armenia could eventually need to import electricity from Azerbaijan, citing the country's reliance on the Medzamor nuclear power plant, which he described as outdated and a potential threat to the region. Aliyev said the plant's lifespan could not be extended indefinitely and that its eventual closure could leave Armenia facing an energy crisis. Pashinyan, meanwhile, said Armenia's strategy is to achieve full energy self-sufficiency through the development of solar power, which we know is quite robust in Armenia, and also energy storage. He added that self-sufficiency would not mean Armenia withdrawing from international electricity trade, saying the country could both export and import electricity, potentially including through cooperation with Azerbaijan, as it does today with Turkey, Iran, and Georgia.
And domestically, Armenia's two opposition factions in parliament offered contrasting views this week on TRIP. Narek Karapetyan of Strong Armenia said his faction considers TRIP a road, not a corridor, stressing that no country will have corridor rights on Armenian territory. He said this position differs fundamentally from that of Robert Kocharyan's Armenia Alliance. Ishkhan Sagatelian of the Armenia Alliance, meanwhile, said TRIP is not an ordinary road, but a corridor that carries risks to Armenia's sovereignty. Karapetyan, however, later explained that, or tried to justify what he had said rather than anything else, that Strong Armenia deliberately avoids describing TRIP as a corridor to preserve its negotiating positions with Azerbaijan if or when it comes to power. He said calling it a corridor now would be used against the party in the future, with Azerbaijan pointing to its own previous statements.
Yeah, and I think we need to say this, that when Armenians of any position use the term corridor, Zangezur corridor, they're basically mimicking Azerbaijani propaganda. And so calling it a corridor is working in nobody's favor. So I think that's just something that we need to have a public consensus on. And on another and familiar diplomatic front, Armenia's relations with Russia remains tense. Last week, Pashinyan raised Russia's trade restrictions on Armenian goods at a meeting of the Eurasian Intergovernmental Council in Kyrgyzstan. Pashinyan said cooperation between members of the Eurasian Economic Union and third-party partners should not be treated as a zero-sum game. He argued that the EAEU should not become an area of restrictions, which it is now, and said the bloc's rules on the free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor are not being fully implemented. He specifically pointed to restrictions Russia has imposed on Armenian agricultural produce and other goods since May of this year. Pashinyan also addressed Russian concerns over Armenia's law on launching the process of EU accession that was adopted last March 2025. In late May, the leaders of 4 EAEU member states said Armenia would need to hold a referendum to choose between the two integration blocs. Pashinyan argued that adopting the EU accession law does not mean Armenia can currently become an EU member. He stressed that simultaneous membership in the EAEU and the EU is impossible and said a referendum would require several steps first, including institutional preparations, a formal application for EU membership, and candidate status. Without those steps, he said, a referendum would be meaningless and practically illegitimate because voters would be choosing between what's existing and one that does not yet exist. He also said Armenia currently has no legal, economic, or political obligations to the EU that conflict with its membership in the Eurasian Economic Union. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Galuzhin responded to Pashinyan's remarks by insisting that Armenia commit to holding a referendum on EU membership versus continued participation in the Eurasian Economic Union before the end of this year. EAEU heads of state are due to discuss further steps regarding Armenia at a summit in December, which could include suspending Armenia's membership in the treaty.
Well, if Russia continues imposing restrictions on Armenian exports, I think EAEU membership would be pointless
anyway,
by the end of the year, which it has. It has now blocked the retail and online sale of more than 70,000 bottles of Armenian-made beverages, including Bijni mineral water, drinking water, and carbonated drinks. Russian authorities said the products failed to meet mandatory labeling requirements and could pose potential health risks to consumers. So it was first Jermuk, now it's Bijni and other drinks.
Which I was drinking yesterday, by the way.
Did you read the label?
I did not.
Well, separately, Armenia's government has allocated over 5.35 million drams to compensate exporters for July shipments of produce, including apricots, peppers, cherries, and flowers. Deputy Economy Minister Arman Kojoyan said Armenian flowers were exported to 26 countries over the past 2 months, fruit to 21 countries, and vegetables to 14. Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexei Overchuk said bilateral trade with Armenia has fallen by roughly 2/3 from around $12 billion in 2024 to $8 billion in 2025, and with a further sharp decline this year.
Well, I
wonder
wonder
why. Yes. He said Russia has repeatedly warned Armenia over the past 3 to 4 years actually, about the risks of its policy course, including a possible drop in trade volume. So it's the policy course after all, not the labeling or the product. I'm getting confused from the information
messages.
coming from Russia.
In other news, tycoon and prosperous Armenia party leader Gagik Tsarukyan is facing a third set of criminal charges. The investigative committee has charged Tsarukyan and multi-group director Sedrag Arustamian with allegedly extorting $2.5 million worth of property from Lebanese Armenian businessman Gevorg Toromanyan and laundering the proceeds. Investigators allege that Toromanyan was threatened with violence and forced to surrender his 50% stake in a jointly owned company more than 15 years ago. Tsarukyan's lawyers have rejected the allegations as completely false, arguing that Toromanyan should be the suspect rather than the victim in this case. Arustamian's lawyer also denied the charges. Now, Arustamian and multi-transport director, anything that starts with multi-group, multi-wellness, is Gagik Tsarukyan's.
Other than vitamins.
Multivitamins. Well, Arustamian and multi-transport director Artur Dalakyan were arrested earlier in connection with a separate case in which Tsarukyan is accused of embezzling around $22 million from Iranian businessmen and laundering the money. Arustamian is alleged to have assisted Tsarukyan in that laundering case. Meanwhile, a separate criminal case has been opened over alleged tax evasion by Tsarukyan's Arinj Mall involving more than $1.3 million. The shopping center's director has been placed under house arrest, while a former director, Samvel Hagopian, has been detained.
And in a separate development, Tsarukyan's multi-wellness gym is suing the Yerevan municipality, challenging the city's decision to take control of the property. The dispute concerns the multi-wellness building in Yerevan's Circular Park, which was transferred to the municipality last month. City authorities said the building had been constructed with violations of regulations. Well, meanwhile, multi-wellness is also asking the court to restore its rights to the property. So it's not just the property has been taken, it's the Yerevan city is operating the property. So it's back working as a gym and a wellness center, but now managed or under the purview of the Yerevan municipality. It was reopened on July 31 and also under a new name. It's called Yerevan Wellness now.
Former Armenian Prime Minister Hovik Abrahamyan's son, Argam Abrahamyan, has been detained on suspicion of ordering a hit on another individual. According to the investigative committee, Abrahamyan, a former mayor of Ardashad and former member of parliament, allegedly ordered the killing of a man outside of a residential building in Yerevan back in April of 2023. The investigative committee statement included highly personal details about the case, prompting criticism from Armenia's human rights defender, who said law enforcement should not unnecessarily disclose information about a person's private and family life during criminal proceedings. The issue also sparked debate within the ruling civil contract party. Arusyak Julhakian criticized the disclosure of this personal information, while others defended it.
And another serviceman in the Armenian Armed Forces was found dead with a gunshot wound this week. The investigative committee has launched a criminal investigation to establish the circumstances of his death. I think they are piling up these numbers, and it's becoming unbearable.
Very
the
much so.
situation to the extent where the Prime Minister said there must be individual accountability for the situation in the armed forces, but he said he did not believe the Defense Minister or Chief of the General Staff were failing to do enough to address the problem.
Well,
This
clearly
is
they
during
are.
a press conference because the journalists were asking, why don't you sack the Defense Minister? He's saying it's not being effective, but they're doing enough, but there needs to be individual responsibility. He added that personnel changes would be made in the military police and the armed forces moral and psychological support departments.
In more positive news and tech news, Firebird officially opened its artificial intelligence data center near the city of Hrazdan. The facility will provide computing power for training and running AI models and will serve both Armenian and international users. 20% of its capacity is planned for Armenian startups, universities, research centers, and educational initiatives, including government-funded programs. The other 80% will be allocated to international companies. The first phase included a $500 million investment and is expected to create around 100 permanent jobs. The company plans to expand the facility in 2 more phases, bringing total investment to more than $4 billion and the number of jobs to around 300. Firebird says the project could eventually become one of Europe's largest AI infrastructure platforms with more than 100,000 specialized computer processors and a power capacity of more than 400 megawatts. The project obviously has raised questions over its environmental impact, particularly water use for cooling. The company says its cooling system operates on a closed loop, meaning water is not consumed during normal operations or discharged into the environment. Anyway, we're going to be publishing an extensive article about the environmental impact of Firebird, and we were expecting far worse, but from our investigation,
At least with water consumption.
with water,
so.
yeah. Anyway, that will be up soon on EVN Report. And as always, we talk about the articles we published this week after taking a couple of days off. Sheila Pailan's Unleashed this week was called Deux Ex Absurdo. I think this is a term that she came up with. And she asks, why do we turn celebrities, influencers, and political leaders into modern-day gods? She explores the psychology of hero worship, personality cults, and our willingness to surrender critical thinking in order to secure, admiration and belonging.
And maybe one of my favorite pieces from this week is by David Khachatryan, Armenia, Nagoya, and the Long History of Who Owns Nature, Armenia's ratification of the Nagoya Protocol, and its role as Armenia will be hosting COP17 that placed the country at the center of a global debate over who controls genetic resources, biodiversity, and the benefits derived from nature. Well, he does a deep dive, and there's a lot of explanation here.
Yeah, I learned a lot. I thought it was a fantastic piece, actually. And our creative tech editor, Ani Toroyan, was in Sevan for several days at the Seaside Startup Summit, a tech event that happens every year. It's called Seaside Startup Summit Beyond the Pitch. And she says that beyond every polished startup pitch are difficult questions, uncomfortable feedback, and constant iteration. After she spent a few days at Lake Sevan, she kind of understood what mentors wish founders understood, startup founders, and why building a successful startup is far harder than it looks.
And Tested and Ghosted is the title of one of the other articles we published this week, A Job Seeker's Guide to Armenia's Hiring Culture. It's by Sona Gevorkian. And she says, as Armenia seeks to retain talent and build a competitive workforce, recruitment practices matter more than ever. She examines the challenges facing job seekers, from pure communication to unpaid assignments, and argues for a more transparent and respectful hiring culture in Armenia.
And a piece that we published today by Karina Avedisian, it's called A Beach House khachkar, and an orchard. Basically, she looks at 3 case studies. I suppose that's the best way to say it. A beach house in Lebanon, Armenian khachkars, and Kurdish orchards in Iraq, which at first may seem to have very little in common. While the legal and geopolitical contexts may differ, she traces the logic, or logic that she sees that connects them, revealing how security narratives can transform people, places, and memory into perceived threats. And that's it for this week. Thank you for listening. Have a safe and peaceful weekend, and we'll be back again next week.